The first phase of the English Civil War lasted from 1642 to 1646. The first 2 years of this period were characterized by the dominance of the Cavaliers, those who were loyal to Charles, due to Charles having ended the war with Scotland, so he was only fighting a one-front war. However, in 1644, Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentary forces, called Roundheads because of their cute haircuts, took charge of the army and remade it into what was called the New Model Army. The New Model Army was new and a model, and that the forces were disciplined, well-trained, and, most importantly, officers were chosen on their own merit as opposed to what their social class was. The first phase of the English Civil War ended in 1646 when the New Model Army captured Charles I. But here, the revolutionary forces began to fall apart. Some favored retaining the king, but simply having him accept changes to the Church of England. Others disagreed with the proposed changes. Charles took advantage of the infighting and managed to escape to Scotland, where he raised another army and prepared to destroy the parliamentary forces. To many, this seemed like treason. And the war began again in 1648. Again, Cromwell and his army won, and the king was captured. But this time there was no chance for the king to escape. The members of Parliament who had favored changes to the Church of England were forced out of Parliament, leaving only 53 members, which will now be called the Rump Parliament, because only the bottom of Parliament remained, and they were completely controlled by Oliver Cromwell. This Rump Parliament put the king on trial for treason, found him guilty, and chopped off his head. I cannot stress enough how outrageous and heathen this act seemed to the rest of Europe, especially those people who believed in the divine right of kings. At the end of the second phase of the Civil War, the revolutionaries had triumphed, and the monarchy had been destroyed. Once the king was removed, the only existing authority was the Rump Parliament, headed and controlled by Oliver Cromwell. They abolished the monarchy in the House of Lords and stated that England was now a republic and would be called the Commonwealth. Cromwell and his government faced opposition from abroad and were forced to put down rebellions by the Irish and the Scots, as well as deal with dissatisfaction from within England. One of these groups, the Levelers, pushed for even more radical changes. They wanted to level out society. They called for radical ideas such as freedom of speech, horror, religious toleration, blasphemy, and, gasp, the right to vote for all men heads of household over 21 years old. But wait, there's more. They wanted Parliament to meet regularly and believed, shock, that men and women were equal. They also called for the government to support the poor and indigent. To the men of the time, these levelers were crazy, and Cromwell thought it was his duty to stamp out these crazies, which he did, very forcefully. Cromwell not only had issues with radicals, he also had issues with Parliament, which he eventually also used force against. Basically, Cromwell's rule was sustained by his control of the army. To legitimize his rule, Cromwell worked with army leaders to create the instrument of government, a written constitution. In place of the king, there was a Lord Protector, Cromwell, and a new parliament was created. But Cromwell had just as much difficulty getting along with this parliament as he had the old, and eventually he dismissed it, divided England into districts, each of which was headed by a military governor, and instituted arbitrary taxes to pay for it all. In just a few short years, Cromwell had become a much worse dictator than Charles ever was, with more ridiculous policies than he had ever had. When he died in 1658, the military tried to rule England, but pretty much failed. In 1660, many English leaders realized that England was going nowhere fast, and they determined the best course of action was to restore the monarchy in the person of Charles I's son, Charles II. When the Civil War began, Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria, and children fled to France. Her nephew, Louis XIV, was the king, and they lived very safely and very Catholically in Paris. When Parliament recalled Charles II, he was ready. He was also much smarter than his dad had been. Even though the monarchy was restored, hence the term restoration to refer to this time period, Parliament retained a great deal of the power it had gained during the Cromwell years. The restoration of Charles II was an expedient to restore stability to England, not a repudiation of the revolutionary changes that had occurred in the previous 20 years. For the most part, Charles II recognized this. However, he did have some ideas of his own that he tried to push on the English people, usually not very successfully. The most significant of these was his attempt to get rid of laws that limited the rights of Catholics and Puritans. Parliament freaked out, maybe because Charles's brother and heir was Catholic, and to ensure that there would be no repeat of the problems with his dad, they issued the Test Act, a law that said only members of the Anglican Church could hold military and government positions. Trouble over the Test Act and the emergence of two factions in Parliament, Whigs, who wanted to bar James from inheriting the throne, and Tories, who felt that he should be allowed to succeed his brother, led Charles II to disband Parliament and rule on his own for 4 years. This might have been disastrous, except that he died and his Catholic brother James became king. James II immediately began challenging Parliament by ignoring the Test Act and placing Catholics in high-ranking positions. The only hope Parliament had was that James's heir was his Protestant daughter Mary, and as long as he didn't have any more children with his young new wife, then everything would be just... Oh, wait. James and his young wife not only had a son, but they baptized him Catholic. So now Parliament was faced with the prospect of a long line of Catholic kings that would be determined to limit their authority at every turn. Desperate, Parliament contacted James's daughter and her husband, William of Orange, and let them know that if they wanted to raise an army and invade England and overthrow her dad, it would be totally cool with them. So William and Mary raised an army, or rather a navy, invaded England, and didn't really have to overthrow James because he fled with his son and his young wife to Scotland. This event is the so-called Glorious Revolution because political change was effected without bloodshed. But our story here is not quite done. Parliament, in order to avoid further conflict with the monarchy, had William and Mary sign the English Bill of Rights in 1689, a document that limited their rights and laid out the powers of Parliament and the rights of Englishmen. This meant that England's government was a constitutional monarchy. The king and Parliament ruled together. For many historians, this is the true end of the Civil War. The fundamental question had been answered. Kings in England ruled by the grace of Parliament, not by divine right. Hadn't Parliament just deposed one king and instituted another? Others look at this as not only the end of the Civil War, but also the true end of the English Reformation begun by Henry VIII. England was, once and for all, a Protestant country. Thanks for listening. Have a great night, and I will see you tomorrow to answer all of your questions.